Chapter 31, Section 2. Some civil rights activists are going to focus their efforts on voter registration. The Kennedy administration had been troubled by all the violence they saw with desegregation attempts, and so they're going to lend their support to voter registration. But everybody kind of underestimated the extent of opposition to this that there was in the South. Let's start in Mississippi. Civil rights activists are going to focus here. In Mississippi, 40% of the population was African American, but only 5% of African Americans were registered to vote. You had some counties that had no African Americans registered. You had some areas still using literacy tests, where they had to interpret portions of like the state constitution in very difficult language like that. Mississippi had a history of racial violence. Between 39 and 50, there were at least 33 lynchings in Mississippi. And so that lends us to ask, why would you begin in Mississippi? It sounds like it's the hardest place. But the activists believed if they could crack Mississippi, they can crack everywhere. Robert Moses of the SNCC is going to choose Macomb, Mississippi to begin a voter registration drive. Out of the 12,000 citizens in Macomb, Mississippi, there were only 250 African Americans registered to vote. So he's going to arrive in July of '61. By mid-August, he's helped register 6 African Americans. Now, that wouldn't seem like it'd be that great of a success, but it was enough to draw the attention of white officials in Macomb. And Robert Moses, in 1 month's time, is going to be jailed, released from jail, beaten, and chased by a mob. In September, his driver, the one showing him around, Herbert Lee, is murdered. And the guys who did it are going to be let off by the jury for self-defense. You're going to have students march in protest with SNCC members. The students get arrested, and the SNCC members are attacked by a mob and then arrested. When the Macomb voter registration drive ends, they have only registered 24 new voters. With this concentrated effort on voter registration, you're going to see the creation of COFO, the Council of Federated Organizations. The SNCC, the SCLC are going to organize this to coordinate these voter registration drives. But the abuse from state and local officials is going to continue. Abuse from mobs. The SNCC office in Mississippi is going to be burned. And the Kennedy administration didn't really step in. They didn't offer much assistance. The question some people asked was, why aren't African Americans registering? Do they want to vote? And the answer is they did, but they're too scared. I mean, there was a year-long registration drive in Leflore County, Mississippi. A year long. 50 new voters is all they got. The fear wins out. If they threaten your family, your ability to provide for your family, that trumps voting. The 24th Amendment is going to be passed in January of '64, banning the payment of poll taxes as a condition to vote in federal elections. It does not apply to state elections, but at least it's a step in the right direction. The SNCC is going to look for a new strategy. Obviously, what they're doing isn't getting people to turn out to vote, to register to vote. And Robert Moses has a suggestion. He says, what if we can get white volunteers to help? The SNCC is a little hesitant, but they do agree, and the plan's going to be called Freedom Summer. And they're going to go to the northern universities, and they're going to look for white volunteers to come help over the summer and register voters. They also got lawyers and doctors to volunteer, so that way if they need any legal help or medical help, they have them right there. They're going to go down to the south, and they're going to start registering people to vote. June 21st, 1964, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner, all part of Freedom Summer, all disappear. 100 FBI, 200 Navy personnel are going to be called in to help investigate. They find the car. And then 6 weeks later, with a tip there, they do find the bodies buried in an earthen dam. This shocks the country. It shocked it in a way African American murders hadn't before, because 2 of these were white. And the registration attempt continues, but many African Americans were fearful. And by the end of the summer, only 1,600 African Americans register. This was not the great success they had hoped for. It's getting towards an election time, and COFO wants African American delegates from Mississippi to go to the Democratic National Convention. But every time African American candidates were presented to the state party, they were rejected. They were told they couldn't come. And so COFO is going to help create their own party, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the MFDP. And they're going to form their own delegation. One of their first delegates is going to be Fannie Lou Hamer. She understood the struggle. She'd been there. When she had registered to vote, she got fired. The MFDP is going to go to the Democratic National Convention, and they're going to be insulted because they are not going to be recognized as a representative officially from Mississippi. Johnson tells them they could have a couple seats to watch. Now you had African Americans not trusting Johnson and the Democrats at this point. Selma, Alabama, you're going to have a voter registration drive in 1965. In Selma, Alabama, there were 15,000 African Americans who were eligible to register to vote, but only 383 of them were registered. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be invited in to lead them, but any African American that tried to register was beaten and arrested. So they're going to organize a protest march. They want to march from Selma to Montgomery, 54 miles. The governor of Alabama, George Wallace, bans the protest. Well, that's not going to stop them. On Sunday, March 7th, approximately 600 people are going to march in protest. As they cross the bridge, as they get to the other side of the bridge, the police attack the marchers. And this was caught on the news. People across the country are going to see this, including in Washington, D.C. Thousands of Americans are outraged at this. Many go to Montgomery to show their support. Johnson himself is also shocked. And on March 15th, he's going to speak to a joint session of Congress and ask Congress to pass a voting rights bill right away. And he encouraged all Americans to take up this struggle. 1 week later, the marchers do finish their march, protected by federal marshals and the National Guard. And Congress does pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which put the entire voting process under federal control. And federal registrars would go to the South and register voters. When we started this, we talked about how in Mississippi only 5% of African Americans were registered to vote. By 1968, the percentage of African Americans registered to vote in Mississippi was up to 57%.